What is my rule of thumb for an assignment fee? I've heard 1K assignment fee for every $100 of rental income. Okay, so this is kind of something I've seen thrown around in sub 2 for years. I've not challenged it. It depends on a lot of variables because when you're saying $100 of rental income, I think they mean cash flow. What strategy are you talking about? Are you talking about like as a long-term rental, as a co-living rental? It really depends on what you're talking about. I don't really care for rule of thumbs. I mean, your rule of thumb should be the property should cash flow at minimum what you're looking for your overall cash flow goal. However, the assignment fee, in my opinion, is not like a rule of thumb thing. For every $100 of long-term rental income, paying $1,000 assignment fee, well, so it needs to generate $1,000 a month long-term rental cash flow to pay someone a $10,000 wholesaler assignment fee. Well, you're probably never going to find that. Property that's generating $1,000 a month of long-term rental cash flow is not going to be sold for $10,000 assignment fee. It's going to be sold for much more. So it's one thing to say, oh, I have this rule of thumb, I have these numbers on a spreadsheet, this is what I can offer. Well, if it's a phenomenal deal like that, someone else is going to buy that immediately, or the wholesaler is going to structure it so they're making a lot more than that. Like, I don't think these rules of thumb work very well. What I think does work really well is understanding cash flow goals and your cash on cash return requirements. So I don't really care what I pay a wholesaler. I tell wholesalers, I don't really care what you're making. I will pay you whatever, as long as I get my returns that I want on this deal. It's up to you to understand what are those returns that you want, base them on your cash on cash return. So for example, on this deal, let's say it's $388 a month of cash flow, but it's a 8.7% cash on cash return. This wouldn't be a deal for me because I'm not hitting my 10% cash on cash return. But in theory, this person's rule of thumb would be, okay, well, I'll pay you $3,000 to $4,000 assignment fee because I'm making $300 to $400 of cash flow. So that's what I'll pay you. Well, I wouldn't go based off that. I think people would buy this deal potentially depending on what their goals are. What I would say is I'm looking for my 10% cash on cash return. So what assignment fee or what other negotiations could be done first? And then last is the assignment. For me, I'd rather have the wholesaler working on my team. I'm not trying to nickel and dime the wholesaler. I'm trying to restructure this deal to make it so that it works for my investment criteria, and it works for the wholesaler to want to move forward with me as the buyer, and it works for the seller because the terms have to make sense for them. So you have to understand where is the most flexibility on this deal. Maybe the seller is getting $24,000 down payment and you negotiate a couple $1,000s off there, and that's how this deal ends up making sense. So let's say it's $20,000 instead. Well, the cash flow is the same, but your cash on cash return, okay, it went up a little bit. It's still not there. What I would do is I would see at what dollar amount, what difference does it then make sense? And then try to back into that number. So let's say 15,000. You're going to need either more cash flow or you're going to need a much lower entry cost pretty much on this deal. That's $19,000 difference. Okay, you're still not even at 10%. So you basically go to zero here. Remember, just because I put this in a spreadsheet does not mean the seller is going to be willing to do this. Don't get that twisted. So even at, okay, we're like pretty close at 9.9. So if we got basically 24,000, so I'm going to put this back here. I'm going to put the 24,000 back. So basically we would need approximately $25,000 off this entire deal to then make it hit your long-term cash on cash return goals. Okay. So if it was 24,000 was 9.9, 25% or $25,000 down removed from the entry cost would then get you to that. However, it does not all need to come from the seller. Really, the real negotiations are, is that going to come from the seller, the agent, the wholesaler? Because if you got to renovate the property, you got to renovate the property. If you got to pay closing costs, you got to pay that. If you need some carrying costs for reserves on the property, you have to do that. So really between the 24,000 to the seller, 6,000 to the agent, and 25,000 or 10,000 to the wholesaler, that $40,000, well, some way, somehow, $25,000 is going to have to be removed for this deal to work for you. I think if that is your goal, that's your criteria, I don't think that's going to be very feasible. Or if you can present it to the wholesaler, I think they can reduce it a little bit and get it sold to someone else. You can tell them, hey, for this to work for me, this is the cash flow I'm seeing. This is the cash on cash return that I'm seeing. I need at least a 10% cash on cash return for a deal like this to work for me. For the 40K entry cost between the seller, the agent, and your assignment fee, I'm going to need $25,000 of that removed. If that is not possible, no worries. Like, I'm not saying it's got to come from your assignment fee or all of it's, you get no assignment fee. However, if that's possible, if we can get $25,000 off the entry cost, I can be your buyer. If not, no worries. I understand. Like, that's really up to you. Understand that the more that you ask them to reduce, the more likely they are to just sell to someone else or not even try to renegotiate and just sell it. So it's really important that your numbers on a spreadsheet make sense for your investment criteria, but also understand the more that you want, the better returns that you want, the less likely it is for you to close on deals. That's why the long-term rental route is really hard, because no matter how much cash flow you make, even on this almost $400 and your goal is 100, it's still really tough to get a high cash on cash return on those deals. When you're talking about this co-living rental where you're making a lot more cash flow, even though your entry is over $35,000 more than it was going to be as a long-term rental, because the cash flow is so much higher and your cash on cash return is so much higher, this deal could work for you. So then it's up to you to determine, am I willing to pay the wholesaler $10,000 for a deal that doesn't necessarily make phenomenal sense as a long-term rental, but it does make phenomenal sense as a co-living rental? Like, it's up to you to decide, is that what you're willing to do or not? That's what I can say. It's less about rules of thumb. You've heard $1,000 for every $100 of rental income as a long-term rental. Like, it's really dependent on what is your buy box? Are these deals fitting within your buy box? What is your investment criteria? And do you think it's reasonable? If you're telling wholesalers all day, every day, this doesn't work, this doesn't work, this doesn't work, at a certain point, you're gonna have to say, either my investment criteria has to adjust so I can buy more deals, or I just understand that I'm only gonna buy these home run deals. I'm not gonna be able to buy I'm not gonna be able to buy very many, but the few that I do buy, I'll be able to buy some of the best deals. It really depends on what your goal is, how quickly you're looking to scale, and what your investment criteria is, your risk tolerance, all of that. So it's very custom. That's why these rules of thumb and all that, I'm not a huge fan of it. Base your investment decisions based on your buy box, your investment criteria, your risk tolerance, and are you getting the returns that you want? And then is it reasonable to actually get these returns and find deals that make sense for that? What a lot of people realize is they have these crazy restrictive investment criteria. They have these crazy buy boxes, and there's a reason why years later they have virtually no deals to actually buy. They have these crazy investment criteria that are not feasible. I think, people hear too much about, this is their buy box, so I'm going to copy this exact buy box. They don't even know if that person's actually buying deals, but they've seen someone post it. So they're regurgitating the same information over and over again. It's going to be very custom and dependent on you, on your buy box, your investment criteria, your risk tolerance, the scalability you're looking to do, and are you actually getting deals that are coming your way or that you're finding that actually hit this criteria? That's ultimately up to you to figure out. I teach that in Super Investors, but that's ultimately up to you guys to figure out, what is it that makes sense for you.